The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that makes even the ticking of a clock sound too loud. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes that had seen years of cases like this, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," he said, glancing down at the speeding ticket in front of him. "You were caught going 20 miles over the limit in a school zone." His voice was firm but not unkind. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" David Carter, a middle-aged man in a neatly pressed suit, shifted in his seat. He had been in court before, but never like this. He was usually on the other side of the room, representing clients as a lawyer. Today, however, he wasn't defending anyone. He was the one on trial. He let out a breath, running a hand through his dark hair. "Your Honor, Before he could finish, a small voice interrupted. "Dad's much worse than that." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Every head turned toward the speaker. A young girl, no older than 10, sat in the front row beside her mother. She had big, innocent eyes and a soft voice, but the words that had just left her lips landed like a bomb in the room. David's face paled. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Emma swung her legs under the wooden bench, completely unaware of the tension she had just created. "That's nothing," she continued, her tone as casual as if she were talking about the weather. "He drives fast all the time, even when there's no reason. And sometimes," she hesitated for a second, then added, "he doesn't even stop at red lights." The courtroom fell in a stunned silence. Even the bailiff, a tough-looking man who had seen it all, seemed taken aback. David swallowed hard. "Your Honor, The judge held up a hand, stopping him. His gaze shifted between father and daughter, intrigue flickering in his eyes. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "is what your daughter's saying true?" David opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The truth was he wasn't sure how to answer. If he denied it, he'd be calling his own daughter a liar. If he admitted it, he'd be digging himself into a deeper hole. Either way, this wasn't just about a single speeding ticket anymore. The judge leaned forward. "I suggest you think very carefully before you answer." The entire courtroom was waiting. The air felt heavy, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Emma, meanwhile, just sat there swinging her legs, completely unaware that she had just turned a simple speeding ticket into something much, much bigger. And then, the judge's next words made everyone's jaw drop. David could feel his pulse in his ears. His mouth had gone dry, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to say. The judge was still staring at him, waiting. The entire courtroom was waiting. Even the people who had just been there for their own cases had now completely shifted their focus to this unexpected twist. Emma, his daughter, sat with the same innocent look on her face, as if she had merely pointed out the color of the sky. She had no idea what she had just done. Or maybe she did. David wasn't sure. He had always known she was observant, maybe a little too observant, but he never thought she would throw him under the bus like this. The judge finally broke the silence. "Mr. Carter," he said again, his voice steady, "is there truth to your daughter's statement?" David took a deep breath. His lawyer instincts told him to deny, to twist the words into something manageable, to control the damage. But this wasn't a courtroom battle with a client. This was real life. This was his daughter. His hesitation was enough to fuel the murmurs spreading through the courtroom. He could hear the whispers behind him. Some people were amused, others shocked. His wife, Jessica, gave him a look, one that said, "Fix this now." But how? The damage was already done. David started, but before he could finish, the judge leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "This is highly unusual," he said, tilting his head. "A speeding case turning into something much bigger." David let out a nervous chuckle, trying to regain control of the moment. "Your Honor, kids sometimes exaggerate." "I don't," Emma interrupted again, blinking up at him. "You do run red lights? And you drive really fast when you're late." David clenched his jaw. "Emma, sweetie, maybe we should..." But the judge wasn't letting this go. "Mr. Carter," he said, holding up a hand to stop him, "I think it's only fair we get a clear answer. You are a lawyer, after all. You understand the importance of honesty in this courtroom, don't you?" David swallowed. "Of course, Your Honor." Then I'll ask again, the judge said, his voice calm but firm. Do you have a habit of reckless driving? The silence stretched. Jessica placed a hand on Emma's shoulder as if to hold her back from saying anything else. The little girl just sat there, her face still unreadable. David exhaled. There was no way out of this that wouldn't leave a stain on his reputation. He was known for being a sharp, well-respected lawyer. He had won tough cases. He had built a career on his words, his ability to argue, to present evidence, to create reasonable doubt. But none of that was useful here. His own daughter had just become the most honest witness against him. Before he could answer, the judge shifted his gaze to Emma. "Young lady," he said, his voice gentler now, "you seem to know quite a bit about your father's driving habits." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I do. He always tells me not to tell Mom when he speeds." Jessica's face darkened, and David knew that whatever trouble he was in now, it was nothing compared to what was coming when they got home. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly, and the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Even the clerk at the desk stole a glance at David, clearly invested in the unfolding drama. "I see," the judge said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "So, Mr. Carter, not only do you drive recklessly, but you also tell your daughter to keep it a secret?" David wanted to sink into the floor. "Your Honor, Before he could attempt any kind of defense, the judge suddenly reached for a document on his desk and flipped through it. "Considering your current ticket and the information that has now been brought to light, I think we need to reassess just how much of a fine you should be facing." David's stomach dropped. "Wait," he started, but the judge wasn't done. "In fact," the judge continued, "given the potential pattern of reckless behavior, we might need to look deeper into your driving record. If what your daughter says is true, this might not be your first offense." David's hands clenched into fists. How had a simple speeding ticket spiraled into this? He had walked in expecting to pay a fine and move on with his day. Now, he was on the verge of a much bigger problem. Jessica sighed beside him, shaking her head. She looked more embarrassed than anything. Emma, meanwhile, just seemed pleased to be part of the conversation. David leaned down slightly toward his daughter, lowering his voice. "Emma, sweetheart, I think maybe we've said enough, okay?" She tilted her head. "But I didn't tell them about the time you almost hit that mailbox." A collective ooh ran through the courtroom. Someone stifled a laugh. Even the judge seemed to fight back a smirk. David closed his eyes briefly. This cannot be happening. The judge took off his glasses and set them down, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Well, Mr. Carter," he said, "it seems your daughter has given us more than enough to consider." David sat up straight, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Your Honor, if I may." The judge held up a hand again. "I will take everything into account before making my final decision. But I will say this," he glanced at Emma, then back at David. "You might want to consider being a little more careful about what you do in front of your daughter. Kids have a way of remembering things." The courtroom chuckled at that, but David didn't find it funny. His reputation was hanging by a thread. The judge looked at the clock. "I'm going to take a brief recess before we continue." With that, he banged his gavel, and the tension in the room finally released, if only for a moment. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Jessica, but her expression said it all. "You're in so much trouble." Emma, meanwhile, just smiled. "Are we getting lunch after this?" she asked, as if this had all been a casual conversation and not the most humiliating moment of David's life. He buried his face in his hands. This was far from over. As the courtroom doors swung open, people slowly filtered out into the hallway, but David remained frozen in his seat. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the weight of 1,000 stares pressing down on him. He had argued in front of juries, had stood his ground against ruthless prosecutors, but nothing had ever felt as suffocating as this moment. Jessica stood, smoothing out her blouse, but she didn't say a word. That was worse than if she had started yelling. David knew that look, calm on the outside, but an absolute storm brewing underneath. Emma, still oblivious to the tension, hummed to herself as she hopped off the bench. "Can I get a cookie?" she asked, looking up at her mother. There was a bakery outside. Jessica exhaled sharply through her nose, clearly not in the mood for requests. "Emma, not now." David pushed himself up from the seat, trying to regain some sense of composure. His mind was racing. He needed to get ahead of this. Maybe he could talk to the judge privately, explain that this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe he could argue that a child's testimony, especially an unprompted one, wasn't exactly reliable evidence. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't work. Emma had spoken with such clarity, such confidence, that there was no way to spin it. The hallway was just as alive with whispers as the courtroom had been. People who had no business in his case were now suddenly invested. A man who had been there for a parking violation shot David an amused glance. "Tough break, man," he muttered before walking off. David clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to respond. He needed a moment to think, to breathe. Jessica finally turned to him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What were you thinking, David?" she hissed, keeping her voice low. "Telling Emma to hide things like that?" He ran a hand through his hair. "Jess, I didn't tell her to hide anything. He sighed, lowering his voice. "It's not like I was doing anything dangerous. I drive a little fast sometimes, sure, but—" "Red lights, David?" she shot back. "In front of our daughter?" He groaned. "It's not like I do it all the time." Jessica shook her head. "Doesn't matter. She remembers. And now a judge knows." In an entire courtroom full of people, Emma was now busy looking at a vending machine, completely unaware of the mess she had created. David leaned in closer to Jessica. "Look, I'll fix this. I just need to figure out how." Jessica let out a humorless laugh. "Good luck with that," she muttered. "Because right now, you look like a reckless liar in front of a judge who decides fines, and possibly worse." David rubbed his temples. She wasn't wrong. Before he could say anything else, he noticed someone approaching. A tall man in a navy blue suit, one he recognized instantly, Ethan Reynolds. Ethan had been David's rival in law school, and over the years, their careers had followed similar paths, though Ethan had taken the route of prosecution rather than defense. Their encounters were always tense, full of silent one-upmanship. And now, of all people, he was here. Well, Ethan said, stopping in front of him, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I heard the rumors, but I didn't think they could possibly be true." David Carter, the so-called legal mastermind, getting taken down by his own kid in traffic court. David forced a tight smile. "Nice to see you too, Ethan." Ethan glanced at Emma, who was still fixated on the vending machine, before looking back at David. "I have to admit, this is a first. I don't think I've ever seen a case where a child unintentionally becomes the prosecution's star witness." David exhaled sharply. "Are you here for a reason, or just to gloat?" Ethan shrugged. "A little of both, honestly." Then, lowering his voice, he added, "You should be careful, Carter. You know how these things work. If the judge decides to dig deeper into your record, and he doesn't like what he finds, well, let's just say this could turn into something more serious than a fine." David's jaw tightened. He knew that, of course. He had been trying not to think about it, but now Ethan had put it into words. "You should have been smarter," Ethan continued, his voice almost pitying now. "You've always been good at talking your way out of things, but today, you've got a witness who doesn't lie. And that's dangerous." David hated how right he was. Jessica, still standing beside him, glanced between the two men. "Is there something we should be worried about?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with frustration. Ethan smiled. "That depends on how deep the judge decides to dig." Then, with a small nod, he turned and walked off, leaving those words hanging in the air. David clenched his fists, his frustration growing. This was spiraling way too fast. What had started as a simple traffic violation was turning into something much bigger, something he wasn't sure he could talk his way out of. Emma finally returned from the vending machine, holding a small bag of pretzels. She looked up at him and frowned. "Daddy, why do you look mad?" David forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not mad, sweetheart." She blinked. "You look like you are." Jessica let out a small sigh, shaking her head as she looked away. David could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had to fix this. But how? Just then, the bailiff's voice rang out from the courtroom doors. "Court is resuming." David inhaled sharply, knowing that whatever happened next could change everything. David took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and walked back into the courtroom, feeling every set of eyes on him. Jessica followed closely behind, her arms still crossed, while Emma skipped a few steps ahead, completely unaware of the storm she had created. The judge was already seated, reviewing documents with a serious expression. The bailiff called the room to order, and David sat down, resisting the urge to fidget. The tension in the room was thick. He could feel it pressing down on him. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked up. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice steady. "Before we proceed, I took the liberty of reviewing your driving record during the recess." David's stomach dropped. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He forced himself to stay composed, but his grip on the edge of the table tightened. "I have to say," the judge continued, flipping through pages, "what I found was interesting." He let the word hang in the air, drawing out the suspense. "It seems this is not your first time being cited for reckless driving." A murmur ran through the courtroom. David swallowed hard. He could feel Jessica tense beside him. He didn't dare look at her. The judge leaned forward. "In the last 5 years alone, you've had multiple speeding violations, some of them dismissed, others resulting in fines. And if I'm reading this correctly, a minor fender bender that, while not serious, was attributed to excessive speed." David clenched his jaw. He had hoped those incidents wouldn't come back to haunt him. But now they were out in the open, on full display for the entire courtroom. The judge set the papers down and studied him. "Mr. Carter, you're a lawyer. You know better than anyone that the law applies to everyone equally, regardless of profession. So tell me, why should I believe that this pattern of behavior is just an accident?" David felt his throat tighten. This was it, the moment where he could either salvage his reputation or let it crumble completely. He had handled countless cases, spun words in ways that turned impossible situations in his favor. But there was no spinning this. Not when his own daughter had already given the most damning testimony. He hesitated, but before he could form a response, Emma's voice cut through the silence. "Daddy doesn't mean to be bad," she said suddenly, her small voice echoing through the room. David's heart stopped. The judge looked at her with curiosity. "Is that so?" Emma nodded. "He just gets in a hurry. He doesn't like being late. And sometimes he says, rules are different when you're running late." David shut his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the weight of the courtroom's reaction. People whispered. A few stifled chuckles. Even the judge pressed his lips together in a way that suggested both amusement and disapproval. Jessica rubbed her temples. "Emma, sweetie, maybe we should let Daddy talk." Emma blinked up at them. "I was just saying what he always tells me." David exhaled slowly. There was no getting out of this cleanly. He had built his career on words, but his daughter had spoken the most honest ones of all. And the worst part? She didn't even realize the damage she was doing. The judge sighed, shaking his head. "Mr. Carter, I've heard a lot of excuses in my time, but I have to say, this is the first time I've had a defendant's own child confirm their reckless habits so openly." David ran a hand down his face, knowing he had no room left to maneuver. He couldn't deny it. He couldn't twist it. Emma had laid out the truth in a way that no defense could counter. The judge leaned back. "I was going to let this be a simple fine," he admitted. "But given the circumstances, I'm inclined to reconsider." David's pulse quickened. "Your Honor, with all due respect." The judge raised a hand, stopping him. "I understand that people make mistakes, Mr. Carter, and I believe you when you say you don't mean any harm. But the law doesn't work based on intention. It works based on action, and your actions suggest a disregard for safety that concerns me." David's stomach tightened. This was spiraling fast. Jessica finally spoke, her voice measured. "Your Honor, if I may, David is a good father. He doesn't take risks with Emma in the car." The judge gave her a pointed look. "Mrs. Carter, I'd love to believe that. But according to your daughter, that's exactly what he does." Jessica had no response to that. David could feel the walls closing in. If the judge decided to escalate the charge, this wouldn't just be about a fine. It could lead to points on his license, mandatory driving courses, or worse. And if word of this got out in legal circles, his career could take a hit. The judge tapped a pen against the desk, deep in thought. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up. "I think I need to make a decision that ensures this behavior stops once and for all." The entire courtroom held its breath. David's heart pounded. Jessica stiffened beside him. Emma, however, just tilted her head and asked, "Are we almost done? I really want that cookie." No one laughed this time. The judge's next words were going to change everything. David swallowed hard, his mind racing as he braced himself for the judge's ruling. The entire courtroom was silent, waiting. Jessica barely breathed beside him, and Emma, still unaware of the weight of the moment, fidgeted with the hem of her dress. Then, just as the judge parted his lips to speak, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A uniformed officer stepped inside, moving with quiet urgency. He approached the judge's bench and leaned in, whispering something too low for anyone else to hear. David's stomach twisted. This wasn't normal. A moment ago, the judge had been seconds away from sentencing him, and now, something had changed. The judge frowned, nodded, and whispered something back. The officer left just as quickly as he had entered, but the atmosphere in the room felt different. Tighter, heavier. The judge exhaled slowly before looking back at David. "Mr. Carter, before I issue my ruling, it appears something else has come to my attention." David stiffened. "Something else?" The judge tapped his fingers against the bench, his gaze unreadable. "I assume you drove yourself to court today?" David hesitated. "Yes, of course. And did you happen to exceed the speed limit on your way here?" David's mouth went dry. His mind replayed the drive that morning. He had been in a rush. Jessica had reminded him about the hearing last minute, and he hadn't wanted to be late. He hadn't thought much about it at the time, but now, as the judge's words settled in, his pulse began to pound. The judge adjusted his glasses. "An officer stationed near the courthouse clocked a vehicle matching the description of your car, going 20 miles over the speed limit less than an hour before this hearing began." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Jessica turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. David felt the blood drain from his face. That can't be right." The judge arched a brow. "Are you saying it wasn't your vehicle?" David opened his mouth, but no words came out. He wanted to deny it, to come up with something, anything to explain it away. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had barely glanced at the speedometer this morning. He had been too focused on getting here, too distracted by his own frustration over something as minor as a traffic ticket. Jessica let out a slow breath. "David," she whispered, her tone edged with something between disbelief and exhaustion. Emma, completely unaware of the courtroom's shift in energy, just swung her legs beneath the bench and asked, "Does this mean Daddy's in more troubles?" David could feel the weight of everyone's gaze. He clenched his fists, his pulse hammering. He was a defense attorney. He was supposed to be the one who found the loopholes, the one who outmaneuvered legal traps. But here he was, caught in a moment of undeniable truth, and there was no clever argument that could get him out of it. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, do you understand what this means?" David forced himself to meet his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good," the judge said, his tone measured. "Because at this point, I'm no longer convinced a simple fine is enough to correct this pattern of behavior." David barely heard the reaction from the rest of the courtroom. His pulse roared in his ears. He had stepped into this room expecting to walk away with a slap on the wrist, a minor financial inconvenience. But now the stakes had skyrocketed. Ethan Reynolds, his old rival, was sitting a few rows back, smirking like he had just won a case without even lifting a finger. The judge's tone was stern, unwavering. "Mr. Carter, you are an officer of the court," the judge continued. "And yet, you have repeatedly demonstrated a disregard for the very laws you are supposed to uphold." He exhaled slowly, then added, "That is not something I take lightly." David's grip on the table tightened. The walls felt like they were closing in. His career, his reputation, everything was on the line now. Jessica shook her head, looking at him with something deeper than frustration. It was disappointment, and somehow, that was worse. The judge straightened in his seat. "I am considering increasing the severity of your penalty," he said, his voice carrying weight. "However, before I make my final decision, I want to hear from you." David felt his chest tighten. This was it, his last chance, his final opportunity to salvage whatever dignity he had left. He took a deep breath, preparing to speak. But before he could say a single word, Emma piped up again. "If Daddy can't drive anymore, does that mean Mommy has to?" The courtroom fell in a stunned silence. And just like that, David realized that whatever happened next was completely out of his hands. David felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The courtroom was silent, waiting for his response. He knew that whatever he said next could determine not just his punishment, but how people saw him, his colleagues, his family, even himself. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts, but before he could speak, the judge turned to Jessica. "Mrs. Carter," the judge said, his expression unreadable. "You've been present for all of this. As someone who knows Mr. Carter better than anyone, do you believe he takes these violations seriously?" Jessica blinked, caught off guard. She hesitated, then glanced at David. He could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to defend him, but she couldn't ignore the truth. Not after everything Emma had said. She sighed. "David is a good man," she said carefully. "He's a great father." But she hesitated again before continuing, her voice softer now. "He doesn't always realize the risks he's taking. He thinks being in control means nothing bad can happen. But that's not how the world works." David felt his throat tighten. She wasn't just talking about his driving. The judge nodded, absorbing her words. Then he turned back to David. "Mr. Carter, you're a defense attorney. You understand better than anyone that accountability is the foundation of justice." His voice was firm but not unkind. "Tell me, what do you think is a fair consequence for your actions?" David exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He could fight. He could argue, push back, use legal technicalities to reduce the penalty. But standing there in front of his wife, his daughter, and an entire courtroom waiting to see what kind of man he truly was, he realized something. For years, he had been bending the rules, justifying every decision with confidence and quick words. But no argument could change the facts. He had been reckless. He had broken the law. And worst of all, he had set a terrible example for his daughter. Emma was still swinging her legs, completely unaware of the storm she had created. She trusted him, looked up to him, and one day, she would grow up and remember this moment. David finally looked up, meeting the judge's gaze. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I think I deserve more than a fine." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Jessica's eyes widened slightly. Even the judge seemed to pause. David took a breath and continued. "I've been careless. I've ignored the rules because I thought I knew better. But I don't. And I don't want my daughter growing up thinking the law is something you can just talk your way out of." He straightened his shoulders. "So if you believe I need to face a stricter penalty, I won't argue." The judge studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "In that case," he said, "I'm suspending your license for 6 months. In addition, you will be required to complete a defensive driving course and perform community service in a traffic safety program." David let out a slow breath, absorbing the sentence. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a wake-up call. And deep down, he knew he deserved it. Jessica reached over, giving his hand a small squeeze. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, a start. Then, just as the tension in the room began to settle, Emma spoke again. "So, does this mean Mommy's driving everywhere now?" She made a face. "She's way worse than Daddy." The entire courtroom burst into laughter. Even the judge cracked a rare smile. David closed his eyes, shaking his head as Jessica groaned. "Emma," she muttered. But despite everything, David found himself smiling too. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running from the consequences. He was facing them. And somehow, that felt like the biggest victory of all. As the laughter died down, the judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling that court was officially adjourned. David let out a slow breath, feeling both relieved and humbled. The weight of the moment was still settling over him, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't trying to find a way around it. He was just letting it be. Jessica stood, adjusting her purse over her shoulder, and looked at him. "Well," she said, tilting her head, "looks like I'm going to be your chauffeur for the next 6 months." David smirked, running a hand through his hair. "Guess so. I'll try not to complain about your parking." Jessica rolled her eyes, but there was the smallest trace of amusement behind it. Maybe they weren't in a perfect place, but at least they weren't at odds. That was something. Emma reached for David's hand, tugging on it. Can we get cookies now? She asked, eyes wide with hope. Court is done, so I think we deserve them. David knelt down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You, my little lawyer, deserve all the cookies in the world. Emma beamed. Yes, but not Mommy's cookies. She always burns them. Jessica gasped dramatically. Excuse me? David chuckled, shaking his head. She's got a point. As they walked out of the courthouse, David felt something shift inside him. The sun was shining, people were moving along with their lives, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't rushing anywhere. He wasn't cutting corners or trying to prove something. He was just here in the moment with his family. They walked toward the parking lot, where Jessica took the driver's seat. David hesitated for a second before getting into the passenger side. His new seat for the foreseeable future. It felt strange, letting go of control, but maybe that was the lesson in all of this. He wasn't always supposed to be in control. As Jessica pulled onto the road, Emma piped up from the back seat. Daddy, does this mean you're going to be, super careful now? David turned in his seat, giving her a small smile. Yeah, kiddo, I think it does. She nodded approvingly. Good. Because I don't want you to get in trouble again. But also because I don't want to be late for cookies. Jessica snorted, shaking her head. Priorities? David leaned back, watching the world pass by at a perfectly legal speed. He had spent so much of his life rushing, thinking he always needed to be ahead, always needed to be one step faster. But maybe slowing down wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe it was exactly what he needed,